Okay, well, let's get going here. Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to see that so many people have joined us to discuss cybersecurity and ways in which you can help protect your organization. So I'm going to start off with a question, which is how many of you that have joined this webinar invite were hesitant to click on the link? And if you're a little hesitant, that is a good thing, because that's one of the things that we want to talk about today. So my name is Jay Parke, and I'm a partner with the CPA firm of Walker and Armstrong. And so Walker and Armstrong is a mid-sized firm with offices located in Phoenix and Tucson, Arizona. And been around for a while. We are celebrating our 50th year in business this year. And it's also my great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Michael Cocanower. And Michael is the founder and president of itSynergy. Michael holds dual degrees in finance and information technology from Arizona State University. He is also, and I'd never heard of this before, but this is really fascinating. He is also a certified ethical hacker. In addition, he's an investment advisor and he's certified compliance specialist. He was also named by the Arizona Republic as one of the top 35 Arizona entrepreneurs under 35. And should Michael ever meet an ethical hacker in person, he is also a black belt in Hwang-Do, a Korean martial art. So we welcome Michael. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about why auditors are so interested in cybersecurity these days. So in 2019, our firm started seeing a significant uptick in ransomware and suspected employee sabotage of accounting files with a lot of our different clients. So I really started thinking back in 2019 that as auditors, we spend a lot of time and a significant amount of resources assessing the risk of incorrect financial information, as well as fraud. And so we spend a lot of time on those areas, as well as compliance matters. And as I was thinking about what we were seeing, I realized that one of the greatest risks that our clients could have from a financial accounting standpoint is the loss of their accounting records, because that's what we were seeing, data being lost, ransomware. So our clients not having access to their information, entire QuickBook files just gone, lost. And so, in that scenario, imagine having to explain to your boss, to your board of directors, lenders, grantor agencies, explain to them, this situation where you lost your accounting files and therefore you cannot provide timely financial information because you no longer have those records and you didn't have access to a backup. So not a good situation, right? So in 2019, as we were working through our audits, what we did is we wanted to respond to what we were seeing. So we started placing more emphasis on IT security. So some of the things that we really started to focus on in our discussions with management is things like backups. So not only whether or not you had a backup, but where is that backup? Is it on your server? Is it on a flash drive? Has anybody tried to restore that backup to make sure that you have access to that information? Because one of the things that we would find is that our clients would say, hey, yeah, we have backups. And then what would happen is for some reason they weren't able to restore that backup, or it was incomplete information. Also started diving into more questions about passwords. How often are passwords being rotated? who's setting the passwords. And so one of the things that we were really trying to get a handle on, because we saw this uptick in breaches of security, is how is the data being safeguarded, and then who has access. So that all happened in 2019. We had a lot of discussions with management about IT security risk. We would have recommendations. And so really the goal is to forge ahead to protect our clients from this specter of lost accounting data. So from an audit perspective, that's what we really started focusing on, and that became a concern of ours, just to make sure that organizations were being protected. So let's fast forward a little bit. In February of 2021, we met Michael, who's joined us today. Met him virtually, actually. Michael's still looking forward to meeting you in person someday. Michael was a presenter at the Spring 2021 Governmental Accounting Conference that was sponsored by the State of Arizona Society of CPAs. Now, I just uttered 3 words: Governmental Accounting Conference. That on surface might appear as boring as spending about 3 months in quarantine. Michael's cybersecurity discussion was not only interesting, but it was highly relevant, particularly as it relates to what we were seeing. It was eye-opening, and frankly, it was a bit scarier than being in quarantine for 3 months with your in-laws. So the next day, our group of auditors, we regrouped, and what we wanted to do was discuss what we had learned from that conference, and talk a little bit about how this affects our upcoming audit season. So we were looking at our December 31st clients and our June 30th, 2021 clients. And so what we had talked about is that we really thought that the information that Michael was telling us about was really relevant to what we had been seeing with some of our clients. So I had an aha moment after I'd met with the team. And I said, well, let's just see if we can host a webinar. We're going to invite as many people as we can. And then we're going to ask Michael if he'd be willing to present. So Lisa from our office called Michael and talked with them about what we had been thinking about in terms of putting on this webinar. And Michael graciously agreed. So again, he's joined us today. Ironically, shortly after attending Michael's presentation, the unthinkable occurred. In January of 2021, someone hacked into one of our clients' emails. So our client email was compromised. An email from that client, which appeared to be a valid email, was sent to me. And a month later, my email was also compromised. So now the mission to fight cybercrime even became personal at that point. So, and even more relevant, because that was something that certainly we had not encountered before. So again, this is really a very relevant topic right now. And so we're really excited to be here and see so many participants. So as we move through this webinar, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box to go ahead and type in your question. Now, this is a live webinar, so the response may not be immediate because we are presenting this on a live basis, but we will do our best to respond to all questions. So, Michael, at this point, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to you so you can educate us on how we can better improve our cybersecurity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. I'm going to ask you to stick around for just 1 second while I share my screen to make sure that you can see that okay. Are you guys able to see the slides? Okay.
I can see it.
Excellent. So great. Thanks very much, Jay. Appreciate the introduction. Excited to talk to you all today. As Jay mentioned, I am a certified ethical hacker, which I like to say means I have all of the powers and skills of a hacker, but I use my skills for good and not evil. So try to fight bad guys in the world rather than being one of the bad guys in the world. So today I'm going to talk to you about defeating the hackers. I'm going to give you some very specific things that you can do to stop them in their tracks. So I come at this thinking like a hacker. And so I'm going to talk to you about how a hacker thinks and how you can maybe try to stay one step ahead of that to try to defeat them. So let me kind of run through the agenda of what I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to talk through some ground rules for today's presentation. Then I'm going to share with you some data and statistics regarding just cybercrime in general, the industry, the dollar volumes involved, et cetera. We're going to talk about 5 specific steps that you can take today to stop the hacker. So my goal is that when you leave today's webinar, you will leave with some actionable advice that you can take immediately back to both your business and personal lives and implement today that will make you a little bit more secure than when you started this webinar. And then I've also added, it's interesting that Jay just shared the story about the business email compromise, or BEC, they call it in the industry, regarding both his email as well as a client's email, because I do have a bunch of slides in here where I'm going to do a deep dive for you on business email compromise. I'm going to show you some specific things that you can look for as it relates to business email compromise and how you can stop that from happening. So we'll give you that as a bonus. And that's even, Jay mentioned this, seeing me at the government accounting conference. This is new content since that conference. So this is hot off the press stuff, the latest and greatest stuff. So let's start out with some ground rules for today's presentation. Rule number 1 is that today's presentation is going to be in English. I like to joke and say that I'm bilingual. I speak both tech and English, but I promise you that today's presentation will be in English. And so I would challenge you, if I get carried away and start throwing out any technical terms or slip and start speaking tech instead of English, please call me out on that in the Q&A box, and I will make sure to explain whatever it is that I was talking about. Now, when it comes to that, you can't have a tech conversation without acronyms. So there are going to be a lot of acronyms today, but I do promise to define all of them. So you heard me, for example, talk about BEC on the previous slide, which stands for Business Email Compromise. So even though I will be using some acronyms, I will tell you what those acronyms mean and explain them so that you've got a good foundation to base it on. And then lastly, I would just offer you this to think about as we kind of launch into the presentation. If you think it can happen to you, I would just submit that if you have a computer or an online account, you're a target. This is one of the biggest mistakes that we see people making, is this assumption that, well, I'm too small, I don't have any important information, I don't have anything significant, the bad guys aren't going after me, they're too busy going after the big fish like the Colonial Pipelines of the world, which we just saw in the last couple of weeks that shut down gas delivery on the East Coast. There's a couple of flaws in that thinking. The first flaw is that you don't have anything valuable. We're going to talk about the value of some of the data that you have as we drill into the presentation. But what I would tell you is, do you have as much valuable information as, say, a Colonial Pipeline or a Bank of America or whatever else? No, you probably don't. But it also takes a lot more effort and sophistication to break into a Bank of America or a Colonial Pipeline compared to you. And so the hackers are just looking at it as a trade-off between the time that they have to spend versus the dollar payout that they get. So yes, maybe they're not going to get a $4.4 million ransom from you like they did from Colonial Pipeline. Maybe it's only going to be a $4,000 ransom instead. But if they can do that with a couple hours worth of effort, it still is pretty good payoff for them and is worth their time. So that's the first flaw in that thinking. The second flaw in that thinking is the thinking that the bad guys are actually intelligently targeting you. In fact, that's not the case. This is purely a numbers game for the threat actors. They're not looking at, I'm going to go after ABC company and I'm going to compromise them. They're looking at, I'm going to send out phishing emails to 500,000 different email accounts, and I know that a certain percentage of them are going to click, and a certain percentage of the people that click are going to give up their password or open a document or take some other action that I want them to take. So this is not I'm targeting ABC company. This is, I'm just going to blast the world with my malicious content. And I know that a certain percentage of people are going to take me up on that. So that's the other flaw in thinking that it can happen to you, because you're not being specifically targeted. You're just one of those 500,000. So why do we care about this? Let's talk about some of the statistics around cybercrime. Well, according to Fortune magazine, 66% of businesses attacked by hackers weren't confident that they could recover. So this is serious business, and in fact can put you out of business. We'll talk as we go through the presentation about, what it's like to go through a cyber attack and experience some of that. But I can tell you, not only is there the financial side of it, if you end up paying a ransom or whatever else, but there's also a tremendous amount of lost productivity that we've seen as we've been involved in hacking incidents over the years with customers and others. So it can be very damaging, and in many cases, things that businesses can't recover for, especially the smaller organizations. This one is a startling statistic to me that today, cybercrime worldwide is more profitable than the entire global illegal drug trade. So if we think back to the 80s and don't do drugs and all that type of thing, and what a big industry the illegal drug trade it was, today, cybercrime, there's more money that flows through cybercrime than the entire illegal drug trade. And so what does that do? Well, all of those organized crime syndicates that were involved in the illegal drug trade back to the 80s have now all pivoted. And so when we think about cybercrime worldwide, you can no longer just think about the guy wearing a dark hoodie in a dark room in the middle of the night, pounding on your computer. It's now run by very, very well organized, very sophisticated, business savvy criminal organizations. A lot of them even have customer service departments to help you with your ransom negotiations and ensuring your files get unencrypted and all these it's just crazy. A lot of them are very concerned about their reputation. They don't want to get a reputation that if you pay the ransom, they won't decrypt your files because they know that then other people aren't going to pay the ransom. So these are very, very large, sophisticated organizations. And they're also rational decision makers as well. So they think like business owners and make rational economic decisions, just like you and I make as business owners. 73% of black hat hackers, those are the bad guys. Those are not the certified ethical hackers like me. Those are the bad guys. 73% of them said that traditional firewall and antivirus security to them is irrelevant or obsolete. And so what a lot of people think is, well, I've invested in a good firewall, I'm running antivirus software, I'm covered. And what this statistic tells you is that the bad guys are saying that is completely meaningless to us. We do not care what your firewall is or what your antivirus is because we've got ways around all of that. And then finally, this is some statistics from the NSA, or the National Security Agency, US government intelligence, that Russian hackers, who are the best, can infiltrate a computer network in 18 minutes. So from the time they decide to start actively breaching a computer network, it takes them on average 18 minutes to be successful. North Korea is just behind them in under 2.5 hours. Given the sanctions that nation is under, cybercrime has become a very, very important industry to them and something that they invest a lot of money on. And the Chinese are currently in third place. However, you can bet that they are rapidly catching up. It takes them about 4 hours from the time that they breach a network until the time that they're successful. This is one of my favorite charts of the year. This is a chart from the Verizon 2019 Data Breach Investigation Report. So every year, Verizon puts out this huge report. They have a very, very large cybersecurity consulting group and work with a number of companies on breach response and cleanup after breach and all those sorts of things. And then every year, what they do is they compile all the data that they've seen from their field work. And they publish this big report every year, which is their data breach investigations report. For guys like me, this is required reading. I can't wait for this to come out every year. And it's on the top of my list to read. So this was from last year's report. And here's what this shows. So we've got 4 different line graphs here. The first graph shows compromise. And so the axis along the bottom, or the x-axis, is amount of time. And you can see the legend down there at the bottom: seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years. So the first is from the moment that an attacker launches their first physical, visible action to attempt to breach your network, on average, how long is it in this Verizon data set until they were successful? And you can see the big bump in that graph is in minutes. So from the time that an attacker starts trying to launch their attack, takes their first physical, visible action, they are successful at compromising within minutes. Then once they're in, the next graph down shows exfiltration. So once they're in, how long does it take before they start to steal your data and copy it to their servers for later use, which we'll talk about in a bit. And you can see, again, we've got a big hump there that starts in the minutes and goes over days. So they have breached your network, they're successful in minutes, and then within minutes, they're going to start stealing your data and copying that to offsite. Now, here's the most disturbing part at all. The third line down shows once they have compromised your network and once they have begun to exfiltrate your data, how long does it take before you realize that they're there and you realize what they're doing? And you can see there that the big hump in this graph is in the months time frame. So just to recap, they were successful in minutes from the moment they started. They started exfiltrating data within minutes, and it takes months for you to realize that they're there. And then the final graph, the fourth one down, shows once you have discovered that they're there, how long does it take you to contain them or to stop the attack and kick them out of your network? And you can see that that's days, because presumably at that point, you've brought in an incident response firm, you've got some professionals involved, and so you're able to kick them out in days. But pretty startling statistics in my eyes in terms of how quickly they're successful and how long it takes for you to figure that out. So many people, potentially even people on this webinar today, may have threat actors that are resident in their network and they don't know it, because you're not going to discover that for months. So let's talk about what the bad guys do. Once they compromise your network, once they get in, what do they do? So number one attack we're seeing today, there's a tie between two things. The first is credential compromise. And so what this means is they're going to somehow get the username and password that you use to log into your system. The way that they're going to do this is they're generally going to send you a phishing email, and they're going to convince you to click on a link. That link takes you to a login screen that maybe you are familiar with, or that you've seen before, maybe even has the logos of the company that you're expecting to log into, like Microsoft or something like that. And they're going to get you to put in your password. But the problem is you have not gone to a legitimate website. You've gone to the hacker's website. And they're getting you to put in your username and password, and that's sending your password to them rather than actually doing anything legitimate. And so once they get your password, the next thing that they're going to do is they're going to log into your webmail, because most of us have the ability to access our email through the web at this point, or maybe even through a mobile device. They're going to start setting up rules in your inbox. And what those rules are going to do is they're going to ensure that you don't see any of their activity. So for example, one of the things that Jay talked about was when he had the customer compromise, an email came from the customer to Jay, and Jay thought that was legitimate. Well, if Jay had responded to that email, there's a good chance, and said, hey, did this come from you? Are you hacked? There's a good chance that the hacker is actually using a rule to redirect that response to a different folder in the mailbox that you don't see, and then is responding back to Jay saying, yes, this is legitimate. Please do what I'm asking you to do. Click on this link or open this file, or whatever it might be. And then the next thing that they're going to do is they're going to start to conduct reconnaissance. So think about your mailbox for a minute. Now, some of us are the 1,000 emails in the inbox type of people. Others are inbox 0 type of people. But think about also what's in your sent items folder. What's in your deleted items folder, right? Like if you emailed a customer a spreadsheet last week that had some confidential information on it, chances are pretty good that that email may be sitting in your sent folder, and that confidential spreadsheet is sitting in your sent folder as well. Even if you utilize some type of technology to send that email as an encrypted email, when it's sitting in your sent items, it's not encrypted and it could be accessible. Same thing with your deleted items. If somebody has sent you some confidential information, or maybe somebody has sent you their password for QuickBooks or whatever else the case might be, that information may be sitting in your deleted items. And so when they conduct reconnaissance, that's what they're going to do, is they're going to start to look at, who do you communicate with? Who are your coworkers? What's your communication style? How do you write emails? Are you very formal? Are you very informal? Do you use phrases? Do you use full sentences, et cetera? That's all gathered during the reconnaissance phase. And then once they have that information, they're going to launch their attack. And their attack could be something like what happened to Jay, where they're going to send emails to all of your contacts that looks like it came from you. And so your contacts think it's legitimate, but you actually never sent that email. It was a malicious actor that's residing in your mailbox that sent that email. So that's the tie. That's the tie for first for one of the things that we're seeing as the biggest sources of compromise today is credential compromise. The other thing that we're tied with is ransomware. And what's interesting is the ransomware tactics have actually evolved a little bit. So let's talk about that. So on the surface, ransomware is a software that encrypts all of your files and data and then demands payments to unlock that data. So you come in one morning, you're ready to sit down and work on your Word documents, your Excel spreadsheets, your PowerPoints, whatever it is that you're working on. And all of a sudden, you log into your computer and a note pops up that says, you've been the victim of ransomware. If you want your data back, you need to pay us a bunch of Bitcoin. It's usually hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, depending on the size of the attack, is where the demand first starts out. And you're not going to be able to get your data back unless you pay that ransom. So here's what's interesting when we talk about the evolution of ransomware is that there's actually a new tactic that's coming out now, and this is being done by various criminal groups. I've got a couple of examples here of crime syndicates, the Maze group, the Egregor group, and basically what they're doing now. So back in the old days, it used to be ransomware person got you to, or the threat actor got you to open a file or click on a link. It installs their ransomware tools and encrypts their data, and it pops up a notice says, pay us a bunch of Bitcoin if you want your data back. And so then my industry responded to that by saying, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we've got good backups of all of your data. And then that way, when the bad guys encrypt all of your data and say, hey, pay us this ransom if you want your data back, we would just say, well, go pound sand. We're not going to pay your ransom because we have backups of everything. So we're just going to restore from backup, and then we're back in business and everybody lives happily ever after. Well, then the bad guys adapt to that technique. And so what they said is, okay, well, now what we're going to do is we're going to start encrypting your backups as well. So that way we don't have your backups. So that was the adaptation at that point, was they would encrypt not only your data, but they would also go out and specifically look for backup files and made sure they encrypted those files as well. So then my industry responded to that. And they said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to start storing those backup files in disconnected locations or in offsite locations that are not immediately connected to the machines that have been compromised. And so again, we went through this, go pound sand. We're not paying the ransom. We have offsite backups. We're just going to go to those and restore our data. We don't need to pay the ransom. And so now the latest things that the bad guys are doing is going back to that Verizon slide that we talked about earlier, is they are, before they encrypt your data, they're exfiltrating all of your data. So they're taking all of your data, or a copy of all of your data, off your server and putting it on their server. And now what they're saying is, not only are we going to encrypt your data and we're going to demand payment to return it, but if you don't pay us, not only are we not going to give you your data back, but we're going to publicize that you have been hacked, and we're going to publish all of your data out on the dark web. And so I just read an article this morning, for example, that the third largest semi-trailer manufacturer in the United States recently had tons and tons of their data published on the dark web, which is an indicator to me that they probably got ransomware and told the bad guys to go pound sand and that they weren't paying the ransom. And so the bad guys took a lot of very highly confidential employee information, vendor information, customer information, passwords, financial data, all kinds of stuff, and published it out on the dark web. And so now what we're seeing is customers, when we get involved in breaches, we're seeing customers make decisions to pay ransom, not on whether or not they want to get their data back, but on the reputational risk and the potential reputational harm that comes from it being publicized that their data, that they've been hacked, that their system has been compromised. And so we had a customer that we went through a breach with last October, who deals with a lot of very large institutional investors. And they were concerned that those institutional investors would be spooked if it got out that they were hacked. And so our customer, even though they had their data, decided to pay the ransom to avoid the reputational harm. So a whole new kind of element in the ransomware thing. And then after that tie for first place of what we're seeing the most of, the third category is just kind of everything else. So data exfiltration, not related to encrypting your data, not related to ransomware. So just they're going to steal data and they're going to try to monetize that on the dark web, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Lateral movement, meaning they're going to compromise one of your users, but then they're going to figure out from there, where else can they get? So, maybe I compromise user number 1 at your office, but then I'm going to use that to then compromise the CEO, because the CEO has access to banking information. And so they're just going to continually try to kind of up where they are in the organization so that they can better monetize. And then the last thing, which we don't see a whole lot of anymore, is bots and crypto mining. And so essentially what this is the bad guy is going to convince you to install a piece of software on your computer, which turns your computer into, the best way I can describe it, is part of their zombie army. So they can use the resources on your computer to then launch attacks against other people, so that when other people get attacked, it looks like it's coming from your computer rather than coming from the bad guys. And so they kind of hide their identity that way. And then crypto mining is just using the processing power of your computer in order to create new cryptocurrency. So let's talk about how they do it. How does the compromise actually occur? Well, the most popular one is that they somehow convince you to click on a link. And that link leads you to a site which looks legitimate and asks you for your credentials. And like we talked about before, oftentimes they'll even have the logo on there, the Microsoft logo, the whatever, Dropbox, Box.com, ShareFile, you name it, DocuSign, there's all kinds of different examples. And it'll even have the proper logos and it'll look just like the real logon site. And sometimes in even the most sophisticated cases, they will actually, when you put in your username and password, it sends the username and password to the bad guys, but then it also redirects you to the real site and sends your username and password to the real site so that you do actually get logged on. So that can make it even more confusing. And then once your credentials are collected, they're going to go to your webmail, and then they're off to the races. They're setting up their rules. They're launching their attack. The other thing that they can do to get to successfully breach your network is they can convince you to open or download a file. And that could be clicking on a Word document that has maybe a macro enabled on it, or downloading a PDF, or even clicking on an exe or other types of files. And when you do that, when you open that file, they're going to install their payload. And so they're going to install their program, which is then going to oftentimes install what they call a RAT, or remote access tool, which gives them remote access to your PC, gives them the ability to copy data, look at your webcam, turn on your microphone, access your files, run a keylogger so that when you type in your passwords at sites, they can get those passwords and then they can go and log into those sites. All kinds of fun stuff they can do with their tools. And then the last thing that they will use as a tactic to attack you is social engineering. And so social engineering is where companies are using social norms in order to try to get you to do something that you might not normally do. So let's say, for example, that your office is protected and everybody has to have a security badge in order to get in the office. So an example of social engineering is I might show up with a very official looking uniform and I'll say, hey, I'm the exterminator and I'm here to spray. And so the receptionist may think, oh, okay, well, I'll let you in. I'm sure we had an appointment with the exterminator to spray. Well, now I've just gained physical access to a secured area that I shouldn't gain access to. Social engineering can also happen on the phone. There is a wonderful video on YouTube. It's about 3 minutes long. If you guys want to go out and Google it, you can Google DEF CON social engineering hack. And there is a young lady that is meeting with a reporter, calls Verizon, and is able to, with about a 3-minute telephone call, completely lock him out of his Verizon account, add herself to the account, and change the password on the account, all just using social engineering. And she uses a tactic of having a crying baby in the background and all kinds of stuff. It's a great video, but a really, really good example of social engineering. So let's talk about why do they do it? Why do the bad guys do it? This is also from that same Verizon report. And you can see that overwhelmingly, the motivation is financial. They're there to make money. And we'll talk on the next slide about exactly how they make money. Secondary to that is espionage. Obviously, a lot of the espionage activity is related to nation states. So the NSA has what they call the Big Four, which is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Those are the ones that like us the least and that conduct the most espionage operations to us. But again, overwhelmingly, the motivation is financial for cybercrime. So let's talk a little bit about the financial. A medical record can be worth up to $1,000 each. A basic record, which is just name, email, maybe a phone number, maybe an address, is worth about $1 a piece. Netflix accounts. So if I can get your Netflix username and password, I can sell that for about $1.25 each. Credit card information can be worth up to about $110 if it's a valid credit card. And bank account information can be worth anywhere between $3 and $24. And so when you talk about, the data exfiltration that we talked about earlier, that's what they're after, is they're after things like these that can be monetized. So for example, if I can get from your organization a direct deposit spreadsheet, well, that has the checking account information or the banking information on all of your employees. And so if you've got 1,000 employees, I've just made $24,000 potentially with that bank account information. I can turn that around and monetize it very quickly on the dark web. So let's talk about who is they. As we talked about before, this is organized crime. These are very large, very sophisticated, well-organized criminal elements. A lot of them located in countries that do not have extradition treaties with the United States. So think about Eastern Europe, Russia, places like that. You can see that state affiliated is second, and there was a period back earlier in around the 2011, 2012 timeframe where state affiliated took over organized crime, but today it is once again overwhelmingly organized crime that is perpetrating this stuff. Okay. So let's jump in. Let's talk about how do you stop them? Great. So you say, I hear all the statistics. I'm scared. What do I do about it? So the first thing to think about is that many hackers are lazy. And by making sure you're doing a few things consistently, you can mitigate a large portion of your risk. Here's the analogy that I like to use to describe this. So if you can imagine, let's say I'm a burglar. And I'm walking down the street in your neighborhood and I'm going to burglarize a house in the neighborhood. I'm going to steal some stuff. So I'm walking down the street and I walk by house number 1, and house number 1 has a little sign out front that says monitored by ADT. They have one of those metal security screen doors in front of the front door. There's a security camera both on the driveway and on the front door. And there is a very large, ferocious sounding dog barking on the inside. So I look at all that as the burglar and I say, okay, I take note of all that. And then I keep walking down the street. And next door at your neighbor's house, there's no outside lighting whatsoever. There's no dog. There's no lights on inside. There's a stack of papers, at least a week's worth, sitting in the driveway of newspapers that nobody has picked up. The trash cans are out at the curb, even though the trash hasn't been picked up for 4 days. So as a burglar, which one of those two houses do you think I'm going to burglarize? Obviously, I'm going to take the path of least resistance. I'm going with the dark house that has no dog, no alarm sign, all that other kind of stuff. Hackers work much the same way. So if I'm a hacker and I want to make a quick buck, am I going to go after Bank of America or am I going to go after your company? The answer is I'm going after your company because it's a much easier target. Bank of America has got a lot of sophisticated defenses in place. And yes, if I'm successful, that could be a huge payoff, but the chances of me being successful against them are so minuscule compared with the average smaller mid-sized business. I'm definitely spending my time on the smaller mid-sized business. And in terms of some of the things that you can do to mitigate, there are just a very few simple things like the dog, like the monitoring, alarm monitoring sign, like the cameras, et cetera. So one of the best examples is multi-factor authentication. And that's a tech term, so bear with me. I've got a whole slide on that as my next slide. So we'll talk about multi-factor authentication, but 68% of black hat hackers, those are the bad guys, say multi-factor authentication and encryption are the biggest obstacles they have to getting into your system. So let's start out talking about multi-factor authentication, or sometimes called MFA, or sometimes also called 2FA for two-factor authentication. So what is multi-factor authentication? Well, first, let's talk about what the factors are. There are 3 potential factors: something you have, something you know, and something you are. So the best example of multi-factor authentication is taking cash out of an ATM. So if you think about the process to take cash out of an ATM, you first put your ATM card into the teller machine. So that's something you have. So we've met one of the factors. Then the very next thing that you do is you type in your PIN number on the keypad. That's something you know. So there's an example of multi-factor authentication. We've had more than one factor that we had to meet, more than one requirement that we had to meet in order to be able to get cash out of the bank. And then the final factor, the something you are, is where we get into things like fingerprint scans, iris scans, voice scans, facial recognition, all those types of things. That's something you are. So that's a little bit less common. Most common forms of multi-factor authentication is something you have and something you know. And when it comes to multi-factor authentication, I would really encourage you to use it. Use it everywhere. So almost every website out there today has some form of multi-factor authentication available on it. So you just need to go and turn it on everywhere. So it's already there. It's just a matter of literally flipping the switch. And then the way that most websites are using multi-factor authentication today is you'll generally install an app on your cell phone, like Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, et cetera. And then every time you turn on multi-factor authentication, you'll use the app to scan a little QR code on the screen. And then that will add a 6-digit code on your phone that rotates every 60 seconds. From that point forward, every time you log into that website, you have to know your password. So that's something you know. And then the something you have is your phone, because that 6-digit code is unique to your phone and it rotates every 60 seconds. And so we've met the multi-factor authentication requirement. Something we know is our password, something we have is our phone. And so all these sites that I have listed here and more, it's available and it's there for free. So turn it on for Gmail, turn it on for your Apple accounts, turn it on for Facebook, turn it on for PayPal, turn it on for your Office 365 account, and many, many more. Amazon, I haven't listed. I mean, I could go on and on. So literally all you need to do is just dig around, go into my account, dig around in the security settings. It's a little bit different for every site, and look for multi-factor or 2-factor authentication and turn it on. And that alone is one of the biggest steps that you can take to defeat hackers, because now, in the example I gave earlier, where they get you to give up your username and password through a fake website, okay, great, they've got your password, but unless they also have that 6-digit code, which they're not going to be able to get without access to your cell phone, they're still stopped in your tracks. And so definitely very important. Second thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is passwords. So I have a list of the top 10 passwords. There's an organization called Slashdot that does a survey every year where they go out and determine what the top 10 passwords are that are in use out on the internet. And I'm going to reveal the latest list of the top 10. And I will apologize in advance to anyone on today's webinar whose password I have just revealed to the world. However, if that is you, I would strongly suggest that you may want to consider going out and changing it, because guess what? What do you think when I'm a bad guy and I'm trying to guess your password? What do you think the first 10 things are that I'm going to guess? It's probably the 10 that are on this list. And you laugh and you look at these and you go, come on, seriously, people have those passwords? Yes, yes, they absolutely do. It is way more common than you think. And if you're sitting on this webinar and you're thinking to yourself, well, okay, but I'm smarter than that. Like, I don't have the word password. I put a 0 instead of the O. Bad news for you. If you think the bad guys haven't figured out that trick, you're mistaken. So there, none of those tricks, like using the @ symbol instead of an A or using a 0 instead of an O, none of that stuff is effective because the bad guys know all of that stuff. So let's dig a little bit more into passwords and talk about some best practices around passwords. So the first thing is, it's best to have a different password for every site. Now, from an IT standpoint, I know that guys like me have been preaching this sort of thing for a long time, but I'm going to talk to you, and people say, well, great, but how am I going to remember, 387 different passwords? I'm going to talk about that. But getting a different password for every site, this is one of my favorite websites out there, and literally a site I use almost every day, strongpasswordgenerator.com. You can go in, there's 4 little slider switches that you can turn on for whether you want to include letters, numbers, uppercase, lowercase, and symbols. You want to turn all those on. You can set the length that you want the password to be. I generally use 16 characters, and then you can just hit a button over and over and over, and it will just sit there and continue to generate random passwords. So this is the site that I use to generate all of the passwords that I have for login to all of my sites. So strongpasswordgenerator.com, and of course it's free. Longer is better when it comes to passwords. So the more characters that you can have in there, the more difficult it is to hack. But again, now we've got this dilemma of, great, so I've got these nice long random passwords, a different one for every site. How am I going to keep track of all that? My answer is, it depends on how thick of a tinfoil hat you want to wear. So there are solutions out there, like LastPass is a great one. That is a cloud-based solution that can manage all of your passwords in the cloud. And so the great thing about LastPass is you sign up for a LastPass account. The basic account is free. You've got to pay a few bucks if you want an account that can be utilized across multiple devices, your tablet, your phone, your office computer, your home computer, et cetera. But even with the paid account, it's not that expensive. And then what that does is, then you only have to remember one password, your master password. Of course, you want to enable 2-factor authentication, so that you have to have that to get into your LastPass account. But then once you're into the account, it stores all of your passwords, and every password is different for every site. So you don't have to remember those passwords, or you don't have to know those. And in fact, LastPass even has a plugin that you can install for popular browsers like Chrome or Edge or whatever else, that will automatically enter your username and password every time you go to a site. So all you end up having to do is, you just visit the site, LastPass puts in your username and password automatically. You pull the key or the 6-digit code off of your phone, because remember, you've set up multi-factor authentication. Now you're logged into the site, and you don't ever even have to know what that password is, because LastPass just stores it and types it in at the moment you need it. Now, that's great, that's good, and I do use LastPass for some of my accounts. If you really want to wear a thick tinfoil hat, there is a secured USB key called an iron key. I actually have one here. I carry them with me all the time. And you can use an iron key with KeyPass. It's a free program that you can install on the iron key. And the advantage of that, and that does the same thing. That's a database that keeps all of your passwords, enters it on the website automatically, et cetera. The difference is, because it's stored on this secured USB device, if this device is unplugged, like this one is that I'm holding in my hand right now, there is no way that a hacker could possibly hack that, because it's physically disconnected from the network. So like I said, the iron key and the KeyPass is really a solution best suited for guys like me that wear tinfoil hats when it comes to security. But it is an option. And if it's an option you want to explore, we do have some videos out. If you go to our YouTube site on itsynergy.com/YouTube, there's a video out there. It's a few years old, but it's called Organize Your Private Passwords. So if you just search for that, it will actually walk you through the process of purchasing the iron key, setting it up, getting KeyPass installed, all that sort of thing. It's about a 15-minute long video if you want to go that route. LastPass, though, is certainly far better than nothing at all. So if you have nothing today, I think LastPass is an amazing first step. And if you want to stop there, that's okay. The last thing I have on here is a little bit of a topic of debate in the IT industry now. So I'll talk through that a little bit, which is change your passwords as often as you change your oil. Now, some of you may have read a lot of very, very prominent security researchers have come out in the last few years and advocated that we should no longer have people automatically change passwords on a regular basis. In fact, Microsoft's official standpoint on passwords is now you should no longer enforce password changes. You should keep the same password forever. The reason for that is because the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that when you force people to change their passwords on a regular basis, like quarterly, for example, what happens is people start to do very predictable things with their password. So for example, if your password is Phoenix, you start doing Phoenix 1, Phoenix 2, Phoenix 3, Phoenix 4 every time you need to change your password. And so that's where the flaw comes with changing your password. The other problem with not changing your password on a regular basis is if you really read in depth what those security researchers are saying, they're saying don't change your password unless you have some good reason that you want to change your password. So for example, one of the things that we do for a lot of our customers is provide dark web monitoring, where we're looking at the dark web and looking for your email address to find out if it has been included in any email breaches. And if we find it, we will then let you know that your password was published on the dark web as part of an email breach, and then you can go and change it. So like I said, a lot of these security researchers are advocating for not changing passwords. What I would argue is that if you have a good solution like LastPass, where you have a number of long, complex, and different passwords for every website that are being maintained for you centrally, that in fact, it is still a good idea to change your password, and you don't need to worry about changing falling into that predictable pattern of changing your password. Also, if you're not going to change your password, if you're going to follow their advice and not change your password, I would suggest to you that you want to do the second part of what they're suggesting, which is ensure you have some type of dark web monitoring so that you know when your password has been compromised and that you can go out and change it. The next tip, number 3, is patch early and often. So just to give you a little bit of insight into how a hacker thinks, the first thing that a hacker is going to do when they compromise a computer on your network is they are going to immediately scan your network for known vulnerabilities. By known vulnerabilities, what that means is bugs in software like Windows or Microsoft or Apple or whatever else that the manufacturer, Microsoft or Apple or Google or whoever, has published, and they've published a fix, but you haven't installed the fix yet. So there are actually tools that the threat actors use. Metasploit is a popular one, where they get into your network and they just turn this tool on, and it automatically goes and scans every host on the network for every known vulnerability that exists. And if you have missed even one patch, they literally just have to hit a button in Metasploit to exploit that patch, and then get in and compromise that system and steal passwords and steal whatever else they want to do. So one of the best things that you can do to defend against that is just make sure that all of your stuff is up to date, because if it's not, they are always, always, always going to find it, because it's not like they're going through a list and looking for every vulnerability. They just have this automated tool that goes out and scans and just reports back to them. Here's one, I found one. Would you like to exploit that now? Yes or no? And so something else you have to be careful about in terms of staying up to date with security patches is don't just think about your operating system patches, so your Microsoft Windows patches or your Apple patches, but you've got to patch everything. So you've got to patch all of your applications. So if you have Java installed, if you have the Chrome browser installed, if you have Adobe Acrobat installed, and even I would encourage you, even beyond what I have on this slide, to think about not just applications, but also devices as well. So if you have firewalls, manufacturers put out patch updates on the software that runs on your firewall. If you have switches or other networking equipment, if you have video cameras, surveillance cameras, all of those hardware devices also have security patches that are released by the manufacturer as well. And so you've got to install not just the Windows and the application patches, but you also have to install those hardware patches as well. Those hardware patches generally have a special name, which is firmware. So what you want to look for your hardware devices is firmware updates. And what you want to look for on the software side is security updates, but very important to keep all those in. And when I read stories every week about breaches that have happened across the country, in a very, very large percentage of cases, the way that the breach occurred was through the exploitation of a patch. So a patch was missing, a patch wasn't installed, and that's how the bad guys got in. Backup and disaster recovery is very important. So the first thing you have to ask is, do you have a plan? And is it written as it relates to backup and disaster recovery? So if you're on this webinar today, is there a report or a notebook or something on a shelf that you can reach up and grab from either your internal IT department, or if you outsource your IT to a technology company, that shows you what exactly is being backed up? When is it being backed up? How often is it being backed up? Where is it being stored? When was the last time we tested it, et cetera? And so having a written plan for all of those things is very important. So if you don't have that, I would encourage you to ask either your outsourced IT provider or your internal IT staff to give you that report so that you've got documentation of that. Very important, as we talked about earlier, to separate backups from the rest of the network and ensure they aren't accessible. As we mentioned, a common tactic of the ransomware, part of the evolution of their threat plan, was to start attacking backups. So they will principally go after backups specifically in addition to the rest of your data. And so the way to protect against that is ensure that you have at least one copy of your backups that are not on the network, not accessible via the network at all. So that could be stored in an offsite cloud storage utility. There are various methods that you can use to separate backups from the network, but you want to make sure that the bad guys aren't able to get to those backups. There's a rule in the industry when it comes to backups. It's called the 3-2-1 rule. You want to have 3 copies of your data. So that's the current copy, the one that you're actually actively accessing. You want to have an on-site backup, and then you want to have some type of an off-site or a disconnected backup as well. You want to have that on 2 different storage media. So in other words, we don't want to put all of our copies of the backup on the same hard drive. We want to have maybe a cloud storage provider and a hard drive locally, or maybe tape. Some people are still using tape for large volumes of data. So 2 different storage media, and you want at least one of those located offsite. And then Jay referred to this briefly in the introduction, but I just want to emphasize it again. Super, super important that you test your strategy. Excuse me, I cannot tell you how many customer engagements we've been involved in where they think that their backup has been operating flawlessly for months or even years. And then there's some type of an incident, whether it's a cyber incident or maybe not even a cyber incident, maybe just it's, a hardware failure, server crash, operating system corruption, whatever. And they go, okay, those backups that we've been running for years and we get reports saying they're successful, let's go to it. And they find out, oh, well, out of our 4 servers, we were only backing up 2. Or they find out, oh, the file where all of our or the folder where all of our financial data is, we weren't backing that up. We were backing the rest of this stuff up. And so I would strongly, strongly encourage you to test your strategy. And there are 2 ways that we encourage you to do this. So you got to think about this separately from the standpoint of backup and disaster recovery. So the simple thing that I would encourage you to do is to test your backups. And the way that you can do that is pick 10 random files off of your shared data, whether that shared data is in the cloud or whether that shared data is in a server on premise. Pick 10 random files out of completely different locations, put those together in a list, and then deliver that list to either your IT company or your IT department and say to them, I want you to demonstrate to me that you're able to restore these 10 files successfully. And make sure you pick a good random sampling. We don't want 10 files from the same folder. We want it from all over. If you have multiple servers, we want it from different servers. If you have different shares or different network drives, we want it from different network drives, the widest variety possible, and just say to them, demonstrate to me that you can restore these 10 files. And you ought to be doing that on a regular basis. I certainly wouldn't do it less than quarterly. And I think it would even be healthy to do it more often than that. But then the second thing that you have to think about is disaster recovery as well. So can we not only restore our data, but what happens if there's some kind of a major incident? We think about oftentimes, well, we're in Arizona, we don't have a lot of natural disasters here, but I will share a story that we had with a customer a number of years ago where they had a server room inside their office. They had a big cabinet, locked cabinet, big stack of servers in there. Everything was set up like it should have been. Unbeknownst, and by the way, they were also on the 7th floor of a large commercial building at 24th Street in Camelback. And so, you don't think about natural disasters, you don't think about floods, you don't think about any of that kind of stuff when you're on the 7th floor. Well, unbeknownst to them, in the ceiling above their server cabinet, there was a valve for an air conditioning system. So it wasn't even that there was a faucet, or we've seen crazy stuff, water heaters up in the ceilings, all that kind of stuff. All it was a valve in a high pressure pipe. That valve burst, and in the space of about an hour, dumped 40,000 gallons of water on top of their server cabinet. So, you think you don't, you think about, well, a disaster, I don't need to worry about a disaster. Well, here's an organization that was in a well-known commercial space on the 7th floor and had a disaster occur. And so the way that you test that is you really need to set up a time on a weekend or something like that, or a business downtime. We've got a holiday coming up. Holidays are great times to do this. You need to put together a testing team, and then what you need to do is simulate a disaster. So go in and shut all of your internal infrastructure down, and then test your disaster recovery plan. Like, see, are you able to recover? Are you able to function? Are you able to run your business by spinning up your backup systems, and see if that works? And I will tell you that we do this regularly with our customers, and every single time with every single customer, we have always learned something from this exercise about something we want to configure a little bit differently, or something that didn't work quite like we expected, or some different expectations we needed to set, or whatever else it might be. So would really encourage you to test not just the backups by having them restore files, but test your entire disaster recovery plan as well. Fifth tip, let me give you a little bit of a tool set, some things to think about. Like we talked about at the beginning, where black hat hackers say antivirus is irrelevant to them. Standard antivirus is no longer enough. It's very, very easy for hackers to work around. What we advocate today is instead a new technology called EDR, or endpoint detection and response. There are really two big players in that market space today, both rated highly by Forrester, SentinelOne and Carbon Black. And basically the difference between traditional antivirus and EDR, or endpoint detection and response, is antivirus is really a pattern file matching, or pattern matching utility. So antivirus software has this huge database of known bad files. Every time a file runs on your system or is accessed on your system, it compares that file against the known database of bad ones. If it gets a match, it stops it, it blocks it, it quarantines it, it shuts it down. If it doesn't get a match, it lets it go on its way. The problem is hackers have figured that out. And so they say, okay, well, I'm just not going to put any files that are in that database on your system. But instead, what I'm going to do is all kinds of nefarious things, like I'm going to run PowerShell scripts, and I'm going to scrape memory, and I'm going to use one process to launch another process, and all super highly technical stuff that bad guys know how to do that we don't even know what they're talking about. The problem is antivirus doesn't detect any of that. What you need is a more advanced tool, an endpoint detection and response tool, that in addition to doing the pattern file matching, also looks at behavioral patterns and uses artificial intelligence to analyze the things that are happening on a system, and looks for a match against behavior that looks like things that a hacker can do or would do if they were attacking your system. And so it's not going to just look at files, it's looking at behavior. And when it sees behavior that looks like behavior that hackers do, it'll shut it down and it'll stop it from happening, and then it'll create alerts and let you know what's going on and whatever else. There's also a new methodology that goes along with this that's very prevalent in the cybersecurity industry today. So back 5-10 years ago, when we thought about cybersecurity, we really thought about it a lot like a castle or a fortress. So if you think about a castle, when you build a castle, you build nice high walls, you put a moat around the edge, you put some alligators in the moat, you put guys at the top of the wall with hot tar and arrows and all kinds of stuff. And there you go, there's your castle. And then anything that's inside the castle is protected. So that's the old method of cybersecurity. The problem with that model was demonstrated by the Trojan horse, which is once I get past that wall, there's no defenses left. There's nothing that you can do, and I can have free reign. And so today, that's why the methodology that we encourage is assume breach, which means you can no longer just focus your energy, effort, and most importantly, investment on that castle wall, on building the perimeter. Instead, you need to focus just as much energy and investment on detecting that the bad guys are there and kicking them out. So think back to that Verizon slide that we covered at the very beginning for a moment, where it talked about they're successful within minutes, they start exfiltrating data within minutes, but then they're resident in your network for months before you discover that they're there and what they're doing. That graph displays a lack of the assume breach mentality. And so if we're taking the assume breach mentality correctly and implementing it correctly, we're going to have tools that will detect that bad guys are there, look for them, and then kick them out. rather than just letting them have their way inside the castle walls, so to speak. We talked about the endpoint detection and response as one of the ways of assuming breach, because again, I'm going to use that EDR tool to look at behavior that's happening on my network after the bad guys are in. So that's one of the things that can let me know that they're there. Another tool that we use very commonly for this is a tool called SIEM, S-I-E-M, that stands for Security Incident and Event Management. And so basically what this is SIEM is a technology that looks at all of the traffic that exists on your network and all of the various things that are operating on your network, firewalls and servers and switches and routers and all that kind of thing. And it sends all that data to a SIEM engine, which then correlates all of that. And again, looks for patterns that match what bad guys do. So for example, one of the things that a SIEM tool will detect, we talked about one of the things that the threat actors will do is try to exfiltrate your data before you realize that they're there. Well, a SIEM tool will see that, and we'll see that there's a large amount of data leaving the network, and it'll actually alert on that so that you're aware of that and you can do something to shut that down. And so what you want to do with the implementation of a SIEM tool is you want to centralize data collection for threat assessment. So if you talk about the SIEM tool that we use, for example, we will point not only all network traffic, so we'll mirror everything that comes in or out of your network between you and the internet. We'll send all of that traffic over to the SIEM for analysis. We'll connect it out to your cloud environment, so your Office 365 or whatever else you're using there. We will have your firewall send all of its logs to the SIEM device. We will have all of your servers and computers send all of their logs to the device. Basically, anything that is connected to your network that has a logging capability or sends network traffic, we're going to take all of that and we're going to push it to this central SIEM device for analysis. And like I said, this is really looked at by artificial intelligence. It matches patterns that it sees with publicly available databases that have actual breaches that have occurred and what those patterns look like, and it looks for matches. And so by centralizing that, by taking all those disparate data sources and focusing them and putting them all into one place, that allows the artificial intelligence engine to have visibility across multiple elements in your network and dramatically increases the probability that you're going to be able to detect that something malicious is happening. Cannot stress enough, and Jay touched on this very briefly as one of the questions that they're asking as part of their audits, but the importance of cyber insurance. Your general liability policy that virtually any business have is most likely not going to cover what you need in the event that there is some type of breach. As I mentioned, we have unfortunately been through multiple breaches. We've actually even partnered with some incident response firms, working with them to respond to breaches. And so we've kind of been in the trenches on these, and I can tell you what happens. And I can tell you that without cyber insurance, it is really going to be a tough road to go down. So cyber insurance is a separate policy that you want to make sure you'll get. And what does cyber insurance do for you? Well, first and the most obvious thing is most cyber insurance policies will cover some form of ransom payment. I can tell you in the incident that we experienced that I referred to earlier with a customer last October, the ransom demand started at $1 million and ultimately got negotiated down to $300,000, but that's still a pretty good chunk of change. The Colonial Pipeline, which is the one that shut down gas delivery on the East Coast a couple of weeks ago, that was a $4.4 million ransom that was paid there. So these are not small numbers that we're talking about. Probably not something that you have just sitting in your bank account doing nothing. And probably not something you want to write a check for. So that's the first and most obvious thing that the cyber insurance can do for you. But also, at the moment you realize that you've been breached, you need a number of resources, very differing skill sets, very quickly, that are highly specialized and have experience doing incident response. And your insurance company is the one that can bring all those resources to bear literally on a moment's notice. So the first thing that you're going to need is you're going to need a law firm and lawyers with experience handling cyber incidents. The reason that you want a law firm involved right from the very beginning is because you want the lawyer on every conversation you have internally, so that those conversations are all covered by attorney-client privilege, because you do not want the details of the breach to get out without you being able to control that messaging and you deciding when you're going to announce that. So the law firm is the first thing that the insurance company will bring in. The next thing that you need is an incident response team. The incident response team is a team of IT specialists that is very highly specialized and focused only on cyber incidents. And there's two responsibilities really that incident response teams bring. Number one is cleanup. So they've got to get the bad guys out. They've got to ensure that the breach is over, that you've actually kicked them out, and then they've got to help you recover. They've got to restore your business operations. So that's the first kind of primary responsibility that they have. And then the second responsibility that the incident response firm has is forensic investigation. So they've got to figure out what happened, what data was stolen, how long were they in there, what specifically did they take, what was compromised, how did they do it, all those sorts of things. That's all part of the forensic investigation. That's the second thing that the incident response team does. And then other resources that your insurance company is going to bring to bear, they'll have a PR firm in case, sometimes depending on the specifics of your breach, you may start getting inquiries from press because maybe it's gotten out that you were breached, maybe some of your data was published on the dark web. And that's not something that you want to handle as an amateur. You want a professional handling that stuff. Also the messaging around the breach. They've also got, the insurance companies also have resources. For example, if you have a notification requirement, maybe personal information of your customers was compromised, and some of the states where those customers are located have notification laws that you have to notify them of that. The insurance companies have mailing houses that can put together the letter that gets sent. They can handle the sending out, all that sort of thing. So just a lot of resources that the insurance company is going to be able to bring to bear. And they're going to be able to do it very quickly. In the case of many of the incidents that we've been involved in, all of those parties that I just described are literally on a massive telephone call within 60 to 120 minutes, so 1 to 2 hours. And there's just no way you're going to be able to pull together those resources with that experience that quickly without having some type of a cyber insurance policy. Another important element to think about is a SOC, or a security operations center. One of the things to think about is that cybersecurity is really a very specific and specialized discipline. A lot of people think, oh, we have IT people and they're handling all the security stuff, or we have an outsourced IT company and they're handling all the security stuff. I would just encourage you to have the specific conversation with them and find out exactly what it is that they're handling and what they're responsible for, and determining whether it's appropriate to bring in or supplement those resources with some outside resources that have more specialization. So for example, we talked earlier about this SIM tool that's aggregating all this data and looking at it, and when it finds something, it's going to raise an alert. Well, you need a professional that can read those alerts and decide whether human interaction is required or whether it's just a false positive and it's legitimate activity. That's a very specialized skill, and probably not something that your IT firm or internal IT folks really have the time to do, in addition to all of their other capabilities or all of their other responsibilities. And so adding a security operations center, whether internal or outsourced, is something that's important. And then finally, I would highly encourage you to develop an incident response plan. And so the last thing that you want is to have to figure this stuff out on the fly. So you get a call at 5 a.m. from your IT person or from your external IT firm that says, hey, we just logged into your server and we're seeing ransom notes on all the server. All your data has been encrypted, whatever else. You don't want to figure this stuff out on the fly. It really is worthwhile to spend the time ahead of time sitting down and writing out a written incident response plan, so that when the incident occurs, you've got that notebook on the shelf that you can just reach up, pull that notebook off the shelf, turn to page 1, and start following the instructions. So, things that go in an incident response plan, who needs to know about it? Who's on the communications team? What order do we let people know in? I mean, you may not want employees coming into the office that day if they're not going to be able to work. So how's your communication trees work? How are you going to let them all know that? How do we get in touch with the insurance company? What's our policy number? Where do we call for a claim? How do we get that process started? Just all these things that you don't want to figure out on the fly, because that's going to be a moment of crisis. You really want to figure this out ahead of time, document it, write it down, and then even go through a tabletop exercise where you simulate a breach and then follow those instructions and see how it goes, see how it works. Okay, so next up, I want to just we talked about business email compromise, which is the thing that Jay kind of led off with in his introduction, where he talked about a customer having their email compromised and then sending an email to Jay, and then Jay having his email compromised. So I want to do just a quick deep dive on business email compromise specifically, and talk to you about how you can combat that and give you some very specific tips with some specific examples. So how do you stop business email compromise? Well, you want to look for common signs of illegitimate email. So some things that you can look for that tell you right away this is probably not a legit email is look for mistakes with grammar, spelling, or English. Oftentimes, a lot of these phishing emails are written by folks who English is not their first language. And so you're going to see, grammatical errors, spelling errors, etc. And so that's one of the first things to look at is if it doesn't have proper English, probably not a legitimate email. Next up, look at the from address. So don't just look at the display name. So you may get an email that says it comes from Michael Cocanower, but my email address, michael@itsynergy.com or mcocanower@itsynergy.com will not be there. So don't just look at the display name, look at the actual email address it comes from. And if it doesn't match the person you're expecting to see, so for example, if you get an email coming from Michael Cocanower, but it comes from say gmail.com or whatever.com, don't open that because that's not from me. That's just somebody who's using my display name to try to fool you. Now, in the case like Jay mentioned, the source of the email was actually from a compromised email account. So this trick doesn't help you there, but in a large percentage of cases, it does help you by just looking at that from address and seeing where it comes from. Next, you want to hover over links. So if there's a link in the email, like click here to reset your password or click here to prevent your account from being deleted or whatever else, hover over the link by just holding your mouse cursor over it. And when you do that, the address that that link points to will pop up. Look at the address that pops up and see if that is actually the legitimate email or legitimate location that you're thinking you go to. So for example, if you get an email that says it comes from Microsoft, hover over that link and see if the address it goes to is something.microsoft.com. If it doesn't, if it goes to some address you've never heard of, that's fake. And so that's something you can look at. One thing I will point out with these last two things is the hovering over the links and the from address is you have to be especially careful with these two things from mobile devices. The problem is when you're scanning through your email on the phone, there is no good way to hover over the link easily, and there is no way, oftentimes only the display name shows and it doesn't show you the from email address. So be especially careful with these two things from mobile devices, phones, tablets, etc. And if you see something that at all looks suspicious, I would encourage you to just pause, look at that on your computer rather than dealing with it from a mobile device where you've got more of these capabilities available to you. Be aware of some indicators that your email may have compromised. And it would be interesting to see if Jay had experienced any of these in the experience that he went through. So some indicators that your email may have been compromised. People tell you that they sent you something and you never received it. So for example, when Jay said he had a customer that got compromised and sent him an email, if Jay had replied to them and said, hey, is this legitimate? Oftentimes the hackers are monitoring the mailbox and will reply back and say, yes, it's legitimate. But that reply is coming from the hacker, not from the real person. So if you suddenly get a call and somebody says, hey, did you just send me this email and you didn't send an email? That may be an indicator that your email has been compromised, especially if you're getting multiple calls, then a much greater probability that your email is compromised. And same thing, if people tell you they receive messages from you that you didn't send. So for example, if Jay was talking to his customer and said, yeah, I got your email, and the customer said, well, what are you talking about? I didn't send you an email. That's also an indicator that maybe your email has been compromised. And so you want to go in and check it out. So let's run through some examples of different email compromises and some things that you are looking for. So I'm going to start out with the most obvious. This is one that I think probably all of us have seen. This is our rich, distant uncle in Nigeria has passed away, and the estate left $52 million that they are looking for a way to place, and they need a recipient for this $52 million. So I think that's one that we've all seen at this point. I think we're all savvy enough to recognize this at this point. This is obviously a scam, and so not something you want to click on, respond to, any of that kind of stuff. So let's move on to one that's getting a little bit better. So you can see here we have an email with an attached Word document, invoice.doc. It has the Adobe logo in there. Dear customer, thank you for signing up for Adobe Creative Cloud. Attaches your copy of the invoice. Thank you for your purchase, etc. So what are some things that we can look at here? Well, the first thing is if you look at the from address, the display name is Johnny Pelletieri, but you can see that the email address ends in .ru, which is a Russian email address. Highly unlikely that Adobe is going to send you an email from a Russian email address. So that's a pretty good indicator that this one is fake. We can delete this email and ignore it. This one's no good. Number 3, is this Chase? So here's a sample email that came in that says it comes from Chase Bank. And you can see here, it's got the Chase logo, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some things we can look for here? First of all, once again, you can look at the from address. This did not come from chase.com. It came from securitycenter.com. So It's getting a little bit better than the one that we saw previously, but still, because it's not, you know, .ru or .russia, but it's securitycenter.com, so a little bit better, but still fake and not something that you need to look at. Next one, not apples to apples. So your Apple ID has been suspended. In this case, you can see they're now getting a little bit better. You can see the formatting of this email kind of, you know, with that background shading, kind of looks like the emails that actually Apple sends. Dear customer, we failed to validate your payment information. Click here to validate your account information. And if you don't click there, it's a very common technique. It can have an impact on your Apple ID status. So a lot of times these phishing emails will create a sense of urgency so that you want to do it right away. And so you can see here, we're now starting to get a little bit better. And interestingly, if you look at the from address on this one, you can see it came from apple.ssl.com. An important thing to note here, and Apple support is a display name. An important thing to note here is the fact that Apple is in the domain name doesn't matter. What matters is you gotta read in this case from right to left. So ssl.com is where this actually came from. The name that's in front of that really doesn't matter. So I could put Apple, I could put Chase, I could put Adobe, I could put whatever I wanted. So read from left to right when you're looking at the from address. And if I wanted to verify this was legitimately from Apple, I'd be looking for apple.com on the very right-hand side instead of ssl.com. So here's one that's starting to get pretty good. This is one I got, and by the way, these are all legitimate phishing emails that I've received over the years. This is one that I've gotten that looks like it came from American Express. Interestingly, if you look at the from address on this one, it came from aexp.com, not a valid American Express domain name. However, AEXP, pretty close, probably fools a few people. So we're definitely getting better here. Also, if you look at the formatting of this message, if any of you have an American Express account, this formatting looks virtually identical to legitimate American Express emails that you would actually receive from American Express. And it's saying you need to update your profile immediately. And you can see the link there in the text. It says it goes to americanexpress.com/account update. However, what I've done here is I have hovered over the link with my mouse, and you can see that pops up the real address that it's actually going to. So even though the text says americanexpress.com, when I hover, what I can see is that no, it's not americanexpress.com. It's actually going to k7audio.com, whatever that is. And I can tell you what that is it's a website that would actually have the American Express logo on it and try to get you to put in your username and password. Once you do, they will log in seconds later with your username and password, and they're off to the races doing whatever they're going to do with your American Express account. Here's one that's starting to get pretty good. This is a secure email message from Alliance Financial, and you can see it comes from alliance.net. Again, alliance.net is not a legitimate domain name that's owned by Alliance Bank. But this one says, hey, here's a secure message. Somebody sent you an encrypted email. This looks like, if you've ever gotten encrypted emails, there is a company, Zix, email encryption company, Zix Mail, that actually does send messages that look exactly like this. And one of the things that this is trying to exploit is very, very common for human nature to want to know, what is this encrypted message? Somebody sent me something encrypted, it must be important. And so I just got to click on this to figure out what it is. Of course, when you click on open message, what you're going to get is you're going to get taken to a website where it's going to ask you to put in your username and password. And then again, bad guys are off to the races. You can see here that down at the bottom, I've also got the little pop-up again where I've hovered over the link. So that very bottom link that says it goes to zixmail.net. When I hover over it, you can see it definitely does not go to zixmail.net. It goes to hotappstore.org, whatever that is, which again, it's a site where it's going to ask you for your password and it's going to have all the appropriate logos on it. This is an interesting one. This one, the subject line was parking ticket and then has a ticket number, and it says it comes from the police department. So this is something that, you know, if you get this, you might initially be startled, like, oh my gosh, I got a parking ticket. I don't want to leave parking tickets unpaid. And this comes from the police department. So a couple of things you can look at here. Again, if I hover over the link, now the link here just says parking fine. You can see where it's in blue there and it says parking fine. But when I hover over the link, it goes to docs.google.com, which is just a Google document, which is, you know, somebody trying to get me to click on something or whatever else. So not a legitimate link. And the other thing that you can look at is, once again, even though the display name says police department, it comes from a .ru address, which is a Russian email address. So also a way that we know that that one is not legitimate. Here's one where we're getting a little bit better. This one came from, or appears to come from, Microsoft. Office 365. It tells me I have messages in my email quarantine since I received my last notification, and that they're going to be removed after 24 hours. So all of the common hallmarks that we've been talking about here. First of all, it's got a sense of urgency. Like if I don't click on this and figure out what's in my quarantine in the next 24 hours, I'm going to lose this stuff. And then secondly, the sense of curiosity that I talked about earlier. Who among us can resist what might be in our quarantine? What good stuff might we be missing? What deal of the week at Amazon might we be missing because the message has been quarantined? And we can't resist the temptation to click continue and find out what's in our quarantine. So some interesting things to look at here is the display name on this one came from itSynergy.com. So now the threat actor is starting to get a little bit more sophisticated, and they recognize that, hey, I'm sending this phishing email to a user at itSynergy.com. You can see there, Cocanower at itSynergy.com. And so they're going to set the display name to my domain name, which is very interesting. And then once again, you can see hovering over that link, we've got this one goes to tagli40-italia.it, which is an Italian website. So definitely not a Microsoft related website. And then the other thing that's interesting as well is even if you look at the email address, again, you got to read from right to left. This comes from itsynergy.com/quarantine or -quarantine-outlook. So a lot of people only read that far and go, oh, this must be legitimate. But if you read from right to left, you'll see it actually comes from illco.com. And so that's how we know that that one's not legitimate. Here's one that starts to get pretty tempting. Review password. So you can see here that the password expires today, and I can change my password or I can continue using my current password. So this is something that a lot of people just won't even take the time to really read. They'll just click, oh my gosh, I want to keep my current password. I don't want to change my stupid password again. Like we talked about earlier, I just got to change it to Phoenix 8 instead of Phoenix 7. And so people will just very quickly, as they're blowing through their email, click on keep current password. And it even comes, you can see down at the bottom there, it says it comes from itSynergy support. Once again, we can look at the from address, and they've incorporated my domain name, itsynergy.com, into the display name to try to fool me. So very, very tempting, especially if you're blowing through a large number of emails very quickly. And then again, if I hover over that link to keep my current password, holy cow, look at where that thing goes. Bunch of gobbledygook there, but if you read that very top line, www.543.543.thuy.ntipack.com, that is obviously ntipack.com. No idea what that is, but that is obviously not associated with Microsoft, not associated with Office 365, and therefore not a legitimate email. So those are some samples of emails to give you some good things to look for. So let's talk about, okay, great. How do you stop it? How do you combat the attack? Well, I have a very, very sophisticated, very technically complex system that will guarantee to stop almost every email attack out there, and it's this: pick up the telephone. So in the case of the email breach that Jay described, if you just pick up the telephone, don't reply back and say to your customer, hey, did you send me this email? Because the hackers are oftentimes monitoring that, and they will reply back and say, yes, I did send you that email. So don't reply back via email, pick up the telephone and just give them a call and go, hey, did you just send me an email with an attachment or a document or whatever else? And they'll go, no, I didn't send you an email. And you say, well, you might want to check things out because I think maybe you've been hacked. And so that is literally one of the best things that you can do to avoid business email compromise is just pick up the telephone and give them a call. I want to leave you with an analogy that I love to use. This actually was an analogy that came from the technical team over at Microsoft before we get to the Q&A, and it's called the sandwich analogy. And so think about this when it comes to evaluating an email. And it's called the sandwich thought process. So imagine if you're just walking down the street one day and a stranger walked up to you and said, hey, do you want a sandwich? Your reaction would be like, no, weirdo, get away from me. I don't want your sandwich. So, you know, it's coming, you're not expecting it, and it's coming from somebody you don't know, not something you want to have anything to do with. Now imagine your college roommate, who maybe you haven't spoken to in 8 or 10 years, calls you out of the blue or runs into you on the street and says, oh, hey, great to see you. Do you want a sandwich? You'd be like, wow, this is so weird. Like, it's great to see you, but we haven't talked in like 10 years, and how odd that you're just showing up and offering me a sandwich. So that's an example where you know the person that's offering it, but the conditions just aren't right. So this is a great tie-in to what Jay described. He knew the sender. It was a customer of theirs, but like, wow, I wasn't expecting an email from you. And so maybe you take it, but boy, your suspicion is really high and your guard is really up. Versus if you and I are friends and we're going on a picnic this weekend and I ask you like, hey, do you want me to, I've got an extra sandwich. Do you want it? You'd be like, yeah, sure, sweet. I'd love to have an extra sandwich. That's awesome. So in that case, I know it and I'm expecting it. So the conditions are right to get a sandwich. And so you can use that same criteria for evaluating the legitimacy of an email. Are you expecting it? Is it coming from somebody you know? Are the conditions right? If all those things line up, pretty good chance it's legitimate. But if some of them aren't, keep your defenses up high. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things, some of the takeaway stuff that I can offer you. Talk a little bit about risk assessment. This, in my opinion, and Jay talked about this, we focus on this specifically on the technology piece, technology risk. Single most important preparation step that you can take, in my opinion, you want to analyze all of the different elements of your technology environment from a cybersecurity standpoint. And you want to compare where you stand against, and I got a bunch of alphabet soup there, so let me define that, the NIST CSF. NIST stands for the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. That's basically the federal government science and technology department. And CSF stands for their cybersecurity framework. So that institute, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, puts out a cybersecurity framework, which is basically an entire set of criteria and documents that talks to you, or that shows you how you need to secure your technology systems. And they have, I think it's 100 and something different criteria that you need to look at, and you meet all these conditions, and that helps you to create a secure system. And so what you need to do is evaluate your technology environment against that NIST standard. And there's all these different areas that you can evaluate: environmental, application, hardware, networking, adversarial, et cetera. So how protected are you, and what's the level of risk that you have in each of these different areas? And so I'll talk a little bit about some free resources that I have for you on the risk assessment. And then I'll also talk briefly about the rapid security assessment. This is something that we do. So we'll come in and do an external port scan and an assessment of your Windows environment. And really the purpose of the rapid security assessment is, to me, the be all end all of testing your cybersecurity defenses is to have a penetration test done. And that's where you hire a professional hacker who's a good guy, somebody like me, to come in and hack your network, but hack it with your consent. And then what they do is, after they hack your network, they'll then give you a report that says, well, here's how I got in. I found this machine that wasn't patched. I found this person that had a weak password. This person clicked on a link, whatever it is that they do, so that you know where the weak points are, and then you can go fix that. But the problem with a penetration test is, normally, even in the smallest of penetration tests, those conversations don't start for less than $5,000 or $10,000. And as we have watched penetration tests happen across multiple customers over time, we see that very consistently there is a small group of common things that the hackers find, or the penetration tester finds, in every single case. And so we designed this rapid security assessment to really come in and strip out that low-hanging fruit. So we can come in and help you find and remediate some of this low-hanging fruit, the easy stuff, the stuff that's detected every time you do a penetration test. And then you can go and have your penetration test done, so that you're not making it easy for them. So that way, when they discover stuff, they're discovering the second layer of stuff, the really good stuff, rather than the super easy stuff that everybody has. And so that's what the rapid security assessment is designed to do, is just peel off that low-hanging fruit so that you're in good shape to go get the follow-on penetration test. So to kickstart the processes that we've talked about, you can get a list of common risks and other templates to help you get that risk assessment done. If you go to itSynergy.com/risk, we give you our template, which has a pre-populated list of approximately 50 different risks that you can assess, and you can download that for free at itSynergy.com/risk. And then you can start with a rapid security assessment to address that low-hanging fruit. We normally charge $24.95 for that. If you mention you saw it on this webinar, we'll discount it to $7.95. So there is my contact information. Feel free to email me with any follow-up questions. I do see that we have several questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to jump over and take those if that's okay with everybody. So the first one was, Alex asked, what is a traditional firewall? So a traditional firewall is basically just the device that you have plugged into your network that exists between your company and the internet. So Cisco makes firewalls, Meraki, SonicWall, there's a whole bunch, WatchGuard, there's a whole bunch of different brands out there, but almost every one of us, if you dig around in that wiring closet, you've got some kind of device that filters traffic between the rest of the world, which is the internet, and your office. So that's that device that sits there and is protecting, is the barrier between you and the public internet. Anonymous attendee asked, how do I know LastPass won't get hacked like Dashlane? The answer is you don't. And so that's why I presented two different scenarios. If you want to wear the tinfoil hat like I do, and you want to do an iron key, like you're not going to hack this unless you physically get access to it. And I can go into some of the security elements that are involved with this. This particular device, if you guess the password wrong 10 times, it will actually self-destruct. So all kinds of crazy stuff with that. So if you want to wear the tinfoil hat like I do, you could skip LastPass and you can go directly to the iron key and the key pass that we talked about. Rainier asks, what is your opinion about remote access into your PC, like log me in? A couple of answers to that. Not a huge fan, but if you are going to use that, which I understand there are legitimate business cases to do that, I would just strongly encourage you to protect it with a strong password, which is something that is long and complex, and something that is unique, that you don't use that password everywhere else. And then finally, and probably the most important thing that we've talked about today is two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. So if you're going to do the remote access to your PC, just make sure that there is multi-factor authentication somewhere between you and the point where you actually answer or access that PC remotely. Gary in IT says, can you address the FireEye hack and the resulting SolarWinds exploit? Can you add Israel to the world list, Stuxnet? So a couple of things there. So first of all, the FireEye hack and the resulting SolarWinds exploit. That's actually an example. We talked earlier about the different audiences that are out there, and that the majority of hacking audiences out there, or hackers, threat actors, malicious actors out there, are crime syndicates. There are also nation states that are actively involved in cybercrime, and the FireEye hack or the SolarWinds exploit is actually an example of that. That was a nation state. The federal government, the U.S. federal government, has now attributed that to Russia. That one's actually a very difficult one to protect against, because in that case, what happened is the perpetrators actually infiltrated SolarWinds, which is a vendor of network management software that is widely used in businesses across the United States. When they infiltrated the SolarWinds network, they actually created a fake patch that was distributed by the SolarWinds software, which allowed the threat actors to infiltrate environments where SolarWinds was installed. So that's one that is super, super difficult to protect against. And that's exactly why we have that assume breach mentality that we're talking about. Like, the problem with cybersecurity in general is that a good guy like me, in order to protect you, has to be right 100% of the time. Whereas a bad guy only has to get it right once. So a bad guy can try 1,000 different ways of hacking you. And if the bad guy is right once, he wins. Whereas as a good guy, I have to be right all 1,000 times. And so the odds are against us. Most likely they're going to eventually get in if they want it bad enough. And the SolarWinds is a great example of that. And that's where that assume breach mentality comes in, is you have to assume that they're in there, and you have to dedicate just as many resources to detecting that they're there and kicking them out. And in fact, that's what happened in the FireEye case, is they had some internal detection where an employee noticed an anomalous VPN login, alerted the security team. They then began monitoring activity and realized that there was a malicious actor in their network. And then finally, Gary refers to Stuxnet. That was a very famous hacking incident by the Israeli intelligence service, where they were able to get a piece of malware into the Iranian nuclear processing facility, cause their centrifuges to spin at a faster rate than they were designed to spin at, cause them to burn out, and effectively disabled and set back by many years Iran's nuclear enrichment capability, all by doing a virus. Nothing physical ever happened to that. We have an anonymous attendee that asked, what's my take on VPN logins? You're probably going to accuse me of sounding like a broken record, but I would say my take is very much the same as remote access to a PC. Protect it with two-factor authentication. So VPN on the surface, I don't have a problem with, as long as you're doing all the things that we've talked about today. So there have been a number of breaches over the past year or two involving VPN servers from various vendors. And the problem is that, the vendor tells you that there's a problem, they release a patch, they tell you to install it to close the problem, and people don't install the patch. And so now you have these VPN servers out there that have this vulnerability that hasn't been patched. So that's a problem with VPN. So you've got to make sure you're staying fully patched. And then I would also encourage you, if you are using a VPN connection, make sure that you've got to have multi-factor authentication in order to make that VPN connection. And then an anonymous attendee asks, how strong is RoboForm for protecting your passwords? I am not familiar with the encryption strategy of RoboForm specifically, so I cannot answer that specifically. I would tell you some things to look for is dig into RoboForm's website about what their security methodology is. You want to look for words like zero trust. You want to make sure that only you hold the encryption keys, because you want to make sure that, you know, a rogue employee at RoboForm, or if RoboForm gets hacked, that they won't have access to your passwords. And so those are some keywords that you can look at as it relates to evaluating any vendor, not just RoboForm. So that is all the questions we have. Jay, I'll throw it to you if you have anything else to add. And if anybody else has, oh, here's another question just came in. Is the cloud safe? Wow, that's a very, very broad question. And the answer is, I think there is no one-time yes, no answer to that. And there is also no such thing as it relates to cybersecurity as a silver bullet. So there is no perfect system. Gary and IT referred to FireEye earlier, which is one of the most prominent security consulting companies in the world. And they got hacked as part of the SolarWinds attack that Gary referred to. So there is no such thing as a perfect system. You know, I joke all the time. The only thing equivalent to a computer that cannot be hacked is the computer that is turned off and unplugged from the wall. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to manipulate an Excel spreadsheet on a computer that is turned off and unplugged from the wall. So you've got to find some kind of a balance there. So there is nothing perfect, but what I would say is, if you're using the cloud, make sure you do all the things that we have talked about today. Make sure you're using multi-factor authentication. Make sure you're keeping your patches up to date, all the other things that we've talked about today, and you're in the best position that you can possibly be in. And then I don't know if it's the same person or not, but a follow-on question, the better question is whether cloud storage is likelier to be secure than local hosting. Let me talk a little bit about that. So first of all, when it comes to cloud storage, there's a wide variety of different cloud storage vendors out there, and they're all different. So for example, if you take a look at Dropbox, by default, Dropbox does not encrypt the data that you store in a Dropbox. So if you're sharing Dropbox data with another user, there's a copy of that data potentially on your computer, on their computer, and not encrypted in either location. There are third-party products that you can get to ride on top of Dropbox. The one that I like is called Boxcryptor, that will actually encrypt a folder inside of your Dropbox, so that improves it. But then you can start looking at other third-party technologies, Microsoft SharePoint, for example, Box.com, ShareFile, other paid services like that do a much better job with encryption. And so a lot of the paid services like that really is a much safer alternative. The thing to think about when it comes to cloud versus not cloud, whatever, let's just take Microsoft as an example as a cloud provider. There is no way that you as an individual or as an individual company are ever going to equal the investment that a company like Microsoft makes in cybersecurity and in securing their cloud systems. So, you know, is storing your shared files in Microsoft SharePoint versus storing it on a local file server? Like, I can guarantee you Microsoft's got better security than your local file server does. That being said, that doesn't negate anything that that we've talked about today in terms of installing patches, multi-factor authentication, all those other things that we've talked about. So another question just came up. Should you shut down your computer every night and not only put to sleep? For our customers, my answer is no. And the reason is because in the middle of the night is when we perform all of our maintenance on our customers' computers. So all those security patches and other things that we've talked about, we're doing all that stuff in the middle of the night because I don't want to interrupt you during the day and do that stuff during the day. So I encourage people not to shut down their computer every night. So it really just depends. If you're going to do all the stuff that we've talked about, you know, installing patches and updates and all that sort of thing during the day, then it's okay to shut it off at night. We encourage our customers to leave it on at night because that's when that's when our little chipmunks do all of their work. And then we had, is the cloud safe again? We talked about that one, and cloud storage, we talked about that one. So I think we have once again caught up with all the questions. So anybody else has any questions? Happy to take those. Oh, here we go. Teresa, do you recommend any special security precautions for working from home? For sure. Some interesting things about working from home. Number one question that I like to ask for companies that are supporting people working from home is, are you going to provide them company-owned equipment, or are you going to have them use their home computer? My preference is to have them provided with company-owned equipment. And for our customers, my preference is for company-owned equipment, because that means all of our tools are on there. So all the things we talked about earlier, the endpoint detection and response, the security incident and event monitoring, all that sort of thing. If you're using corporate-owned equipment, all of my tools and monitoring is going to apply. And so I'm much more comfortable with that model. The problem is if you're using your own personal equipment, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if you've installed your patches. I don't know if you're running antivirus. I don't know if you're running endpoint detection and response, all that sort of thing. So that's one of the first things I would say in terms of a precaution is, from a corporate standpoint, I think it's really important that you use company-owned equipment that you have configured in accordance with company standards to have people working from home. Second thing you want to think about, we talked about VPN, but you definitely want to make sure that you've got a secure encrypted connection between the remote location, a home office or whatever else, and back to the office. The most popular and most common way of making secure encrypted connections is over VPN, or virtual private network. Again, if you're using a VPN, that's great. You just want to make sure it's protected with multi-factor authentication. So those are probably the two top things that I would think of when it comes to special precautions for working from home. Susanna says, you talked about not turning your computer off at night. Should you just log off each day? Will that still allow updates to be installed? The answer is yes. That's what we encourage all of our customers to do, is to log off, but leave the computer turned on. The reason we want you to log off is just oftentimes when we install updates, we need to reboot to complete the installation of that update. And if you don't log off, it means potentially you've maybe left a Word document open that hasn't been saved or whatever else. So if I reboot, you're going to get upset with me because I just made you lose all your work because you hadn't saved your Word document. So by logging off, I can ensure that you've closed everything, you saved all of your documents, you've gotten out of all of your programs. And so that's my preference, is to have you log off and just leave the computer turned on. Any other questions? Happy to take any of them. We are caught up again.
So Michael, this is Curtis. So one of the
yeah.
questions that we've been asked a lot on the audit side is the working from home, with them using their personal Wi-Fi. If you're using a VPN connection, is their personal Wi-Fi still secure?
Yeah, so the personal Wi-Fi is not, I mean, it could be secure, we don't know because it's a personal connection, but if you're using a VPN connection through the personal Wi-Fi, then effectively what you're doing is you're creating kind of a hardened, secured tunnel that your traffic flows through the middle of. So people can see, bad guys, threat actors can see that there is a tunnel there, but they can't see the traffic that's going through the inside. So if you are using a personal Wi-Fi connection in a work from home scenario, you just want to make sure when you're connecting to any corporate resources that you're using some type of a secure connection or VPN. And again, not to be a broken record, but make sure you're using multi-factor authentication. I also see there was a question here I missed. Is it safe to save passwords in the computer and remember password? No, absolutely not. Super bad idea. That is very, very easy for threat actors to access. And in fact, when they compromise your computer, that's one of the very first things they're going to do, is they're going to go and dump that list of passwords, and then they're going to go try those passwords everywhere else that they can think of, both inside your company and outside your company, in places like Netflix and Gmail and whatever else, because it's likely you might have used those passwords somewhere else. So definitely do not use the save password when it pops up and asks you if you want to save it. If you do want to use an online utility, look at one of the ones we've talked about, like a LastPass, for example. I think that is all of the unanswered stuff. Happy to continue taking questions if anybody else has answers, but so far we've gotten through everything pending. I think we may have answered it all. It finally slowed down. I think maybe everybody is swimming with too much cybersecurity information, and they're all maybe huddled in the corner in the fetal position at this point, Jay.
Yeah, I think so, Michael. Well, great job. Just an excellent presentation, just like the one that you gave in February. Just great information. And to me, what I'm getting out of this is that we have very sophisticated criminals out there, and we just really need to stay ahead of the curve. And like you said on the onset of the presentation, it's important to not ever think that you're not vulnerable. And so I think we always have to be on our toes. You know, I was thinking back to my email situation, which is when we really went back and looked at how that could have happened, because we use MFA on everything, what we found out is that I'm the person that is often traveling in a lot of remote locations. So I'll use my email off of my C drive. So what we did is we added MFA just for Outlook when I'm using it on my C drive, because that was really the only area that we could think of where there was any vulnerability. So, but yes, certainly everybody, you know, great recommendations here. Stay on your toes, stay ahead of the curve. The criminals are, you know, they're pushing the envelope all the time in terms of their sophistication. We have seen significant damage to some of our clients. It's really heartbreaking to see, you know, see it when it occurs. So I just can't stress that enough. So some of these, you know, some of these main things that you've really focused on, Michael, which are MFAs, very important. If you don't already have them, get them. Password maintenance, use these services as it relates to these passwords. Don't keep passwords on your computer. Don't keep passwords where hackers can obtain them. Please don't save them. And, you know, just great recommendations. So really appreciate your time, Michael, and just all the effort that went into putting this together. And we're just about out of time. So I think that's really about it.
Yeah, and we did have one other question that came in. Somebody asked if they're able to get a copy of the presentation. So Jay, I will make sure to send you a PDF of the presentation, which so people can get in touch with you to follow up on that if they want a copy of that PDF.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Have a great day.
All right, thank you, everybody.